Hello everyone, welcome to this tutorial on Cinema 4D cameras. In this video I will demonstrate the functions of the camera, target, 3D stereo, and motion cameras. This is Pete Maric with Triplet 3D. So let's jump right into Cinema 4D, and I already created a scene that we'll be working with, and let's just create a camera. The cameras can be found up here in the main menu. Camera object, and we'll look through the camera by clicking this icon right next to the camera. Or the other thing that we could do to look through the camera is we can go to cameras, use camera, and make sure our camera is checked. Okay, so jumping into the perspective view, let's go to our camera and object tab. So the first thing is the focal length. You can play with the focal length by either dialing in a custom number right here in this little tab. We'll just leave it at 36 for right now, or we can go and select some of these predefined focal lengths. So if we go super wide, 15 millimeter, that's going to give us a really wide view. If we go into wide angle, 25 millimeter, it's going to zoom in a little bit more. Classic, that's the one that we started with. Going right down, normal lens, 50 millimeters, it's going to give us a little bit more zoom. We have portrait, 80 millimeters. Again, we're zooming in a little bit more. Tele is 135 millimeters. That's getting super zoomed in. And then we have a super tele right here at 300 millimeters. Very zoomed in. Okay, so I'm just going to change this back to classic. That's what we'll be working with. The next thing that I wanted to show you about cameras is we can start offsetting this. So if we offset the X, which is this parameter, notice what happens to my camera in the top view and in the perspective view. So I'll bring that back. So it's actually offsetting our camera in the X position by 30%, and I'll just put that back down to 0. And now if you check out the front view over here and I offset the Y, it's just going to bring our camera up or down. With our cameras, it's controlled the white balance. So the white balance is found right down here. Again, you have the option to input a custom parameter. Just put in 1,000. So here's our predefined parameters for our white balance. So if I go to candle, that's totally going to change the look of my entire scene. I can go down to shade, 9000K, and that completely changes the look of my scene as well. So play around with this for your scene until you get it however you want it to look. Okay, the next thing that I want to show you is depth of field. So if we go into details of our camera and enable, I want to show you on the top view as well. So right now we don't have any depth of field enabled, so I'm just going to enable some rear blur, and that's done by just checking this box. And you'll notice that when I enable depth of field, I got this extra little node on my camera. So I'll uncheck that and check it, so there's this little extra node. Okay, so right now if I take a render, I don't have any depth of field on this, and the reason is that we have to come into effects in our render settings and add depth of field. So now when I take a render, you'll notice that I have some blur in the background of it on these back buildings over here. And the way that you control the depth of field is you can control the blur strength right here. So if we bump this up to something crazy like 37%, here's what's going to happen. We get a ton of blur. So let's just bring that right back down. Now let's put it at 10% so we can see what's happening. So here's a 10% blur. Here's our 5%, 10%. This was 37. Okay, so that's depth of field. The other thing that you want to do is when you're rendering your final, you want to add depth of field into your multipass. So just come into your multipass tab and add depth, and that'll ensure that you have another channel that's just a depth channel. One last thing that I wanted to show you about this is the near and far clipping. So right now let's just enable far clipping and take a render, and what we're going to do is we're going to take this number down. Let's see what happens. So basically what this far clipping is going to do, it's going to start cutting off by the amount that you specify. So what's happening is I have 5,000 centimeters specified, so anything outside of 5,000 centimeters over here is going to get cut off in the renderer, So let's just decrease this to 3,000 and give it a little bit more. So now you're seeing that it's being cut off after 3,000 centimeters. And what we can do is we can also enable near clipping. So this will start clipping it in the foreground as well. And we have to have a high enough number for that. Let's try 1,500. So now it's cutting off some of our foreground geometry. And that's just the camera. It's not actually cutting off like the geometry, but that's just right through the camera. So if we don't look through the camera, we see all of our geometry. And the last thing that I wanted to show you was this really nice feature called the composition. So what this is going to do, it's going to allow you to enable some guides for you to be able to set up your composition before rendering. So I just enabled the grid, and we could specify how many cells that we have in this grid. Typically I'll leave this at 3. There's another one, triangles. So if we come into here, here's all of our options. We can go to mode 2, we can mirror this thing, we can flip it. Those are our triangles. Golden spiral. Here's all of our options down here. We could center it, we can align it to the top, we can align it to the bottom. Here's a diagonal, and the only option that we have is a mirror for that one. Here's a golden section. We could just increase these iterations, and we can also turn off some of these iterations as well. And crosshairs. This is pretty straightforward. We can just control the size of our crosshairs. It gives us crosshairs in the center and on all sides of our composition. So that's the composition tab in our camera. So the next camera that I wanted to show you is the target camera. And pretty much the way that this thing works, it's exactly the same as the first camera that I showed you, but what you end up having in a target camera is a target. So this target, the camera is going to always point towards this target. So if I take my camera and I move my camera, notice in the top view what ends up happening. So here's our camera, or our target right here, and then I'm going to select my camera, and when I move my camera, it always wants to point to this target. So here's what happens in the perspective view. When I do that, it's always pointing right towards that target. And with this camera, you have all the same parameters as the camera object, nothing different. You can enable your depth of field on this one. You can control the focal length, just like we did a few minutes ago. So that's the target camera. So if you click this target tag, it's going to show you right here the target object, and that's this right here. So target tag. If you wanted something else as the target object, you can just click and drag into this target object field. Okay, next thing I want to show you is the stereoscopic camera. I'm going to jump into a different scene. Here's a scene that I created, really straightforward, really simple, nothing to it. And let's just create a 3D stereo camera. So the difference between this camera and a regular camera is, if we come to stereoscopic, typically the mode of our regular camera is mono. So if I change this back to mono, you're going to notice that this 3D on this camera just disappeared. So change it back to symmetrical, now we have a 3D camera. And what that's doing, if I go into my top view, the stereo camera is actually making two cameras side by side. So again, here's mono, we have one camera. Symmetrical, that's going to give us two cameras. Once you have the stereoscopic camera in your scene, you're also going to have to enable stereoscopic rendering in the renderer. So right now, if I jump into my perspective view and take a render, you're going to see that we get a stereoscopic effect. Okay, it's pretty straightforward. And typically you want to use the off-axis tab right here for the placement. And we can also control whether we see the stereoscopic effect. If we go into options and enable stereoscopic, we'll be able to see the stereoscopic effect in the viewport. And that's the stereoscopic camera. Pretty straightforward. I want to show you the motion camera. Okay, so if I come up here, we have motion camera, and I'm going to look through this camera. But what I want to do is I want to just rotate it around. So I'm kind of looking at the spheres. So I'm going to take my entire motion camera setup, and I'm just going to rotate it this way, and I'll just move it down a little bit. So the motion camera, we're looking through the camera just like we did in the first camera that I demonstrated. This is going to give you a motion camera tag, right away when you create a motion camera, you're going to get a path and you're going to get a target for this motion camera. And those can all be accessed through this motion tag. So you'll notice right away you have this path spline, which is this right here, and you also have a target, which is this target. So the way that this thing works is it wants to move along the path. So if you come in here and just play with this camera position, you'll notice that our camera moves right along that spline. Come back into my tab, and here's our camera position. So, oops, that was the intensity. Here's our camera position. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over to frame 1, and I'm going to hold down Control and set a keyframe for our camera position A at 0%, and then I'll jump over to frame 90, and I'll set this camera position to 100%. Okay, so now we're walking along that path. I'm walking along the path. And there's our basic camera animation. Now if we come into motion, what this is going to allow us to do is add some footsteps. So if I just crank this all the way up to 100%, you're going to notice it kind of looks like someone's sort of running with the camera. It's probably a bit too much. I'll bring this down to 47. Yeah, that's better. And we can also control the head rotation of this as well. So just add that in there. And it'll give us a nice natural looking walking camera animation. The very last thing that I want to show you is animating a camera along a spline. So what I did was I created a new spline, and what we're going to do is create a new camera. And looking through this camera, what I want to do is I want to create an Align to Spline tag. So with the Align to Spline tag selected, I want to grab my spline and place it right into this little field where it says Spline Path. And with our Align to Spline tab selected, we can go to the position and we can control how this camera moves along the spline. But right now it's not really moving in accordance to the spline. It's always pointing in the same direction, so I want to check this tangential option. And now when I move along the spline, it's going to move that camera in the same kind of, it's going to move right along with that curve. So that's the Align to Spline tag. This is Pete Maric with Triplet 3D. Hope you enjoyed this lesson, and thanks for watching.